written down there below.
Welcome to the latest video in my Writers in Conversation series. I'm Madeline Dyer and I'm joined today by Jill Stegman. We'll be discussing how and why we write about personal topics that some critics generally advise people to avoid, believing these topics are too melodramatic or heavy. We'll be talking about why we're both committed to telling these stories and the pieces of advice that we have for others who also want to write heavy stuff. So yeah, my name is Madeline Dyer. I'm primarily a YA fiction writer, but in the last year, I've moved a lot towards personal essays and memoir. And in January this year, my first memoir released. So this is it here. It's called Captive, and it is a memoir in poetry that is based on my own therapy writings that I made when I was suffering from severe OCD and psychosis due to brain inflammation. So Jill, would you like to introduce yourself and your book?
Yes, I'm Jill Stegman, and my book is One Pill Makes You Stronger. It details and elaborates on my husband's psychosis under the influence of a drug called prednisone, which is a strong anti-inflammatory, generally prescribed for a variety of reasons. In his case, it was after a bone marrow transplant. And under this drug, he became psychotic and suffered what appeared to be a bipolar disorder. I tried to get help for him because he was too out of control to get help for himself. And the doctors basically wouldn't listen to me in terms of needing psychiatric intervention. And my husband subsequently became severely depressed and sadly, very tragically took his life while I was trying to call a psychiatrist myself. And the story kind of starts there, but goes on to my recovery and research into this topic and the fact that it is quite prevalent that people suffer from psychotic reactions under prednisone. And so the book started off just kind of writing about my history and my struggle in recovery with my husband, and it kind of turned into something else. It turned into my own story and my ultimate advocacy for patients and for the public. And my background includes writing in fiction mostly. And once this happened to me, I turned to writing personal essays and memoir. And I have a degree, a Master in Fine Arts in fiction writing, actually. So this was started my interest in writing memoir and personal essay.
Okay, yeah. Firstly, I'm really sorry to hear about your loss.
Thank you.
I can imagine it would be such a difficult thing to write about in like many respects. Like, how did you go about writing something like so personal and like such a topic as this?
Well, it started off, it was very difficult. But it was something that I felt that I had to get it down. You know, I had to get these incidents down on paper, and I had to write. I wanted to write, you know, as being help, and the writing itself wasn't necessarily therapeutic, but felt like had been working on a novel, and I just put that down. I said, you know, I need to do something else. I need to address whatever's going on with me, at least getting it down on paper. And so that's how this started, how it evolved. I guess I started taking some workshops and writing small portions of it, and it kind of kept evolving in that kind of a format.
So when you first started writing it, did you realize that you would be sort of like producing this whole book on it all, or was it just very much sort of like little sort of like essays and like little fragments that you were writing in? Like, at what
Well,
point?
yeah, I think it started off pretty much like essays. I was right, and then I realized there was so much more to be said, and I was encouraged to start including and going deeper, as I say, you know, and into the whole issue, and not just as a testimonial, but as you know, as an artful project, you know, an actual piece of creative nonfiction. And I realized with encouragement that I did basically have a memoir here rather than just one long sort of expose about prednisone. And I didn't even think that I was writing about prednisone, and it became the topic that most people saw I was writing about. But you know, I see it as a lot more than just writing about prednisone. It's about recovery and resilience and how someone copes with these monumental problems that are thrust upon them. A normal person, you know, just going. That's what I represented. Just someone who there was no background. There was nothing to lead to this with my husband's situation. We were just leading a basically very normal, happy life. We'd been married for 40 years very happily married with children, you know. It was the American dream kind of story. And then this happened, and, you know, so that's basically a long-winded answer to your question.
Okay, yeah, because like before I met you, I hadn't heard of like these like risks with taking prednisone. When you were writing your memoir, did you do like a lot of research into this and like find other sort of like similar things that had happened?
Well, I did do, you know, the research started as I was basically diagnosing my husband myself, because I couldn't, the doctors wouldn't intervene, the doctors that he had. It was kind of left up to me. And at the time, my husband was not willing to participate in someone at that level of psychosis and mental illness doesn't necessarily see that they need help. They think it's everybody else. So I basically trying to figure out what was wrong with him. And so I started doing a lot of research about the effects of prednisone and bipolar disorder and what it could happen. And it started talking about mood disorders. You know, I started seeing research indicating that. I thought, well, I think this is what his problem is. And then research, well, what is bipolar disorder? And thought, wow, it sure seems like the way he is. I mean, he's violent. He's abusive. He wasn't physically abusive, but he had changed dynamically. His voice had changed. He was a different person. And so, yes, the research was really helpful. And I thought, well, if I know all this, why don't the doctors know this? And so I tried to convince one of his doctors, who's a very well-known bone marrow transplant, a physician, and she just kind of brushed me off. You know, they didn't want to listen. They thought they knew best how to handle him. And then when I was writing the book, I did more research to sort of back up what I was saying, but I was encouraged not to include a lot of research. And so there was a lot more there that I didn't even include, just sort of continued to back up what I was saying.
Yeah, like it does sound extremely frustrating. That whole process of like doctors not taking you seriously and assuming that they know better when obviously you could see like firsthand the changes that were happening.
Yeah, and I don't know if it sounded like you as well had to go through quite a bit of your own personal research to come up with a diagnosis for what you thought you were going through, which seems like it would have been really horrifying.
Yeah, so well, it was in December 2018 when I just suddenly started hallucinating, and I developed severe OCD literally overnight. So like I went to bed one day and I was absolutely fine, completely like normal for me. And then the next morning I woke up and I just felt like a different person. But yeah, it took 6 months for doctors to realize that I had brain inflammation that was causing all these changes.
Yeah.
Because like, first of all, they just diagnosed me with like OCD and said it was just like a severe anxiety problem. But yeah, I was getting like loads of physical symptoms as well. Like I couldn't stand up and like I couldn't balance a lot of the time. I was just falling over. My speech was getting really slurred and I just felt like really scared. But the doctors would only focus on like the mental health like symptoms that I was getting. So they just kept like giving me sort of like antidepressants, antipsychotics, referring me for therapy. And none of that worked. And it was only 6 months into sort of this ordeal. Like I was sure something else was going on, because like I didn't think that an anxiety disorder could explain why I couldn't stand up and why I couldn't balance. Because like I used to be an inline skater and do gymnastics, so like I had pretty good balance, and then suddenly it just all gone. But yeah, I came across the sort of like this spectrum of autoimmune disorders where antibodies attack the brain, and the more I read about those, the more sure I was that that was what I had. But trying to get doctors to test me for it, because they were saying, oh, well, we already know what's wrong with you. It's just this, and you just need to take like these antidepressants and you'll be fine. But like I'd been taking those for months and I wasn't getting any better, and I was getting a lot worse. I was getting like double vision, and well, at one point I completely lost my ability to speak and I couldn't communicate verbally, which then made it even harder to sort of like advocate for myself. Luckily, my family was so supportive, and my mum did like a lot of research as well, and she went to the appointments with me, so then she could like speak on my behalf, because like I was just really struggling to communicate. But yeah, eventually we persuaded this doctor who's like quite local to me just to like try the treatment for the brain inflammation, which is like really strong antibiotics and steroids. And she said, well, we may as well just try it because there's nothing to lose by trying it. But it was clear that she was just sort of like humoring me, and she just thought that like, oh, I'll give her these medications just for like a week, and then if there's no improvement, we can just like say, oh, it's definitely a mental health problem. But there was a massive improvement within hours of me starting like these antibiotics and steroids. And yeah, it revealed that I did have like severe brain inflammation. So then they then started then doing brain scans and a lot of other tests. I had like a lumbar puncture as well, and they were like analyzing my spinal fluid. And then yeah, they found that I had autoimmune basal ganglia autoimmune encephalitis. So the part of my brain that was inflamed was the basal ganglia, which is responsible for habit formation, emotion, motor control, and it is linked to the other parts of the brain responsible for like verbal communication. So it did explain like all of the symptoms. But yeah, even after like I got this sort of provisional diagnosis of like, well, doctors were pretty sure it was that, I was then like having great trouble accessing any treatment, because the type of it is usually seen in young children. And it was just before my 24th birthday when this happened. So then they kept saying, well, yeah, we'll diagnose you with this, but only children can be treated like long term. So that was so frustrating. So it was like a year where I sort of like I was on and off antibiotics, and it was just a case of trying to find a doctor who could continue treating me for it. And yeah, like with the pandemic and everything, I've now had to switch my treatment over to private doctors, because the NHS in the UK, they're so like overwhelmed and overstretched with resources at the moment that they've just said that they can't continue treating me. But yeah, it's a lot of frustration, and sort of it is about perseverance. And yeah, my memoir, it's well, I've got 2 memoirs, so like the second one isn't out yet because I'm still working on that. But that is sort of like a full narrative.
I think I've read part of that.
Yeah, you did, yeah. So yeah, like my first one is just based on the therapy writings and like the poems that I wrote during the time when I couldn't like communicate verbally. So that was sort of like the only sort of way that I felt able to express myself. And writing poetry as well allowed me to still feel that I was a writer and that I could still hold on to that part of my identity, because I found that I couldn't write my fiction anymore because that part of my brain was just so like inflamed that I couldn't do that. So the poetry was so helpful for me. But yeah, I just found that once I'd like released this poetry collection, it didn't feel that I'd done enough to sort of raise awareness for this condition. So that's what's really motivating me to finish my
Yeah, I think that uh, I think that it's really impressive that you've decided to do that and that you've started with poetry. From what I've read of your first chapter, I think you're going to have a really interesting meld of both writing creative nonfiction and poetry. And maybe poetry is the way to start. I mean, I didn't start that way. I know but I think that is kind of a way of get the visceral feelings down on the page, perhaps. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, so like, well, I've got sort of this draft of like the full memoir written, but because I've got a lot of like gaps in my memory now where I can't remember the stuff that's happened because of like the physical effects of a brain inflammation. During those months that I'm talking about in my memoir, the only sort of like memories I have are these therapy poems. So I have incorporated a lot of the poetry into like this second memoir. So it's a bit of an amalgamation of like sort of like traditional narrative. It's got like interviews with like my friends and family where I'm asking them like what was I like at this point, because I can't remember it at all. I mean, it's got my therapy writings and like the poetry. So yeah, it's just got like a bit of everything sort of like all mashed together at the moment. And I'm finding writing it is just so healing because it's just teaching me a lot about what I've already experienced, and I'm sort of like finding this new level of understanding with it. And but yeah, like my background is completely different because like I write YA fiction, and like I've got 6 novels out, so I've just been quite surprised with the sort of like difference between writing a novel and then writing this memoir, because I don't know, like it is so personal to me, and I think that's why I'm finding it harder because like I write fiction for like escapism, and obviously when I'm working on a memoir, it's so personal. There's like no escapism at all. So I do find it like quite draining in a way, but it's also hugely cathartic writing it because it's just helping me understand everything.
Yeah, I think that I was really impressed with your prologue and first chapter in how you were experimenting, and you were obviously the narrative, you obviously had a background, your fiction background was coming into play there. You're writing your scenes and the development of the narrative that I saw, and then the prologue having sort of a different tone and feel. I think that you are headed in a brilliant direction with your.
Oh, thank you.
Nice to see it when it's done. I wish that I had sort of had the tools perhaps to write poetry. Wasn't as daring, I guess, as you were. And I never, when I sat down to try to write poetry, it was almost like a constipation. I wanted to do lots and lots of words and then, hone it down and edit it. And to get everything into just a few words is very tough. And it has been actually. I've tried to do some poetry workshops since I wrote my memoir, and it's been difficult doing that.
Well, yeah, definitely. Like before I wrote this poetry collection, like I'd never really written any poetry before because like I briefly studied it at uni when we were doing like this creative writing module. And I just remember like on the weeks where it was poetry, I was just thinking like, oh, I wish it was prose or like fiction this week because I wasn't interested in poetry. And it was only when I sort of like lost this like ability to verbally communicate, and at that point I couldn't write fiction because like my memory was so bad, I just couldn't remember like what I'd written earlier in the scene. And I just found
Yeah.
poetry so useful and like really apt for what I needed it to do at that point, because like I could just sort of like work on, like, I think I remember I was working on like this two lines of a poem for about a couple of hours one day, and like I felt a bit like that I should have been able to do a lot more in that 2 hours rather than just like write 2 lines. But at the same time, it was like this like great sense of like achievement for me, because like although like my brain was so inflamed that I couldn't speak verbally or like communicate, and I was so scared and I was hallucinating all the time, but I had still managed to write like this fraction of a poem. But yeah, since my brain has started to heal with like the treatment that I've been having, I have tried writing poetry again and I can't do it. It's just, it's really stupid. But like, since I did, it was just sort of like, I was drawn to it at that point because it was kind of what I needed to write at that point, because I couldn't write anything else. Whereas now, sort of like, I'm functioning a lot better cognitively. So I'm able to write fiction and like this creative nonfiction and memoir. And yeah, I don't feel as connected to poetry now. So it's a bit weird for me, like, I've got like memoir and poetry out. But yeah, when I wrote all those poems, like I didn't know that it would be a collection, because like, I was just writing for myself to sort of like process everything I was feeling and like my frustrations and different emotions that I couldn't like tell anyone about. And it was only afterwards when like I showed a couple of them to a friend, and she said that it showed her like a really good insight into how I'd felt and how trapped I'd felt. And like it was only at that point that I then decided, oh well, maybe I should look into releasing some of these therapy poems as a collection in order to raise awareness. Because yeah, raising awareness is like the hugely motivating factor for me that is driving me like to write creative nonfiction.
Yeah, I think that's exactly for me too. There was just this thing you expect, at least, you know, being me being raised in this middle class, entitled, I guess you would say, background. I thought, you know, something happens and you go and, you know, the doctors will take care of it, of course. You don't expect a fight. You don't expect something to happen and like, oh no, you know, this is obviously a problem here, and no one is doing anything. And when you can't get anyone to do anything, and it's powerless, you feel so powerless when you're not in sync with whatever the established authorities are, be they medical, police, or whatever. There was, it's very horrifying, I think, terrorizing in a way. And I'm sure with you actually going through it, it was even worse than for me, who was witnessing it with my husband. And that is, I think that's why it kind of, the book almost turned into an advocacy thing, because that's how I got my power back that way. I felt like I had some kind of power, writing things down and hopefully empowering someone else who may be going through the same thing or maybe experiencing it. It could be something like what you went through. It could be something, it could be the prednisone issue. There's so many different areas where people who are, you know, once you're out, not lockstepping with whatever in the trajectory of you're supposed to be, once you go out of the bounds a little bit, that's when you start feeling tension. And I think that's what empowered me to write it, even though a lot of it was very, very rough. It was tough. I would write parts of it that were, because of course I was encouraged, I had to go back and dig deep into some of these issues, experiences, and relay them as faithfully as I could from memory. And I got to the point where I had to actually, I would write it, I would get up and I would just feel compelled to do my writing. And then I would actually have to go and take a nap. At one, it gets so tired, I would just get so drowsy, I would just collapse for about a half an hour. And then I would wake up and go get some exercise, or, you know, I had some kind of a routine that I did. but I knew that if I waited too long, the events wouldn't be as visceral, they wouldn't be as real, and I wouldn't remember them as clearly. And there really was no one else to be able to document the events other than me. I mean, I didn't tell a lot of people specifically about what was going on because it was too scary. And in situation, you just the way I was raised in my, particular demographic, you didn't go around talking about your husband becoming insane and screaming at you and, telling you that, trying to write you out of their off as a beneficiary and calling you just horrible things that you experienced in 40 years of marriage. There weren't a lot of people that I felt like I could, relay that information to, because ultimately, what were they going to do? I mean, there wasn't. I did start seeing a therapist, but going back and reliving that experience, like I said, it was just tough.
Yeah, like I have found, like, with my own writing that like, because I've been sort of like editing the earlier chapters of my sort of like bigger memoir. It is very draining reading it and just like putting myself back at that time and place when it was just all so scary, and it's very sort of emotionally draining, like this type of memoir writing. But yeah, what you were saying about sort of like writing it down when like it's all still clear to you, and like I really relate to that because I started writing like the full length memoir about a year ago, and it was just when I just started the treatments for the first time, and I just felt like this need that I need to record this because I just thought I've already forgotten a lot of stuff due to the brain inflammation, and I could forget all of this stuff. And like what really surprises me now is when I'm going back and like editing these sections of this memoir is that I have forgotten a lot of the details that I'd written down before. So I'm just really pleased that I did actually start writing it and recording it and preserving like exactly how I was feeling and all the things that happened, because I'm sure that if I was to start writing it now and I didn't have anything written, it would be a very different book, but it wouldn't be accurate and I wouldn't feel that it could be as honest. And I think like honesty is hugely important in this story. Because like I'm writing obviously from my own point of view, like it's a first person narrative, and I'm like I lead sort of like the reader through the episodes of psychosis that I experienced, and I wouldn't have, if I was just writing this now without having already written it down, I wouldn't have been able to be as honest about it. But I don't know, it's kind of scary as well because I'm writing about all this stuff that happened to me, it doesn't paint me in the best light at all, and I do find that quite scary in a way, sort of like that I will be putting this book out there one day, and it's really not a great like depiction of like my character at these points when I was like experiencing all these psychoses episodes. But I think it's really important that like I be honest about it because it does show sort of like the dramatic changes to a person's personality when they're experiencing this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that what's going to happen too is that as people read it, of course, depending on how it's presented, they will realize that you were not in control when happening. And so there will be, people will empathize with your situation. And you have interviews and, there's enough I can see, especially in the beginning chapter, there's a lot of very sympathetic in the ways that the readers will engage with you as a person, for sure. And that's really evident, and it's good that you put that in the first chapter. With me, I think I got a reader's reaction from Goodreads about how I was just, another lady kind of crying about her situation, or it was in those words, and most other people were sympathetic.
Mm.
And I didn't really write it as a means of trying to garner sympathy, but I think when you write things down exactly as they are, so critics say that you are setting yourself up for a reaction from other people, that you're trying to get people to feel sorry for you, or you're trying to, I guess what they refer to as navel gazing.
Mm.
In my case, in writing about trauma, I had to get it down the way it was. And I think that, you and I as women sometimes have to face the fact that when there's sort of a general, or at least I got some criticism about writing down these facts as they were and being melodramatic,
Yeah.
kind of thing. And it's interesting that this melodramatic term and memoir and confessional memoirs seem to be, the criticism seems to be pointed to women writers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If a man were to write about these incidents, you never hear that. You hear it's like, oh, this is just, raw, eviscerating. And in fact, I've read some memoirs recently by men that are very detailed and very graphic, mostly in violence and in sexuality. And that, what you hear is that they're just, encouraging that kind of writing for them. And it seems like there's sort of a discouragement. I don't know if you felt that too, for women to be writing that way. We're told to, when I was writing, I was always told, oh, you should pull back from that experience. Don't write it raw. Tell it kind of like with a perspective. And at one point, I had written a chapter, and one of the workshop leaders I was working with gave me the story to read it was about a sloth.
Mm-hmm.
She was pointing that out as like sort of used as a metaphor. And I think that metaphors are great. They're important in literary writing, but my feelings I could not transfer exactly to a metaphor, especially a sloth, or someone told me to read The H is for Hawk. And I think that's an excellent book, but it wasn't what I wanted to write. What I wanted to write, I thought I could portray myself in my own words. I think that at some point, that type of metaphor is important, but sometimes just getting the words down in some kind of, even though it's visceral and raw, is what you need to do initially, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, what you were saying about sort of like female writers being treated differently to male writers in terms of like conveying emotion. Yeah, like that is something that's just so relevant. Because yeah, like typically I'm just thinking from like a sort of like main character perspective in fiction, because this is a like thing I've been sort of like looking at quite a lot recently. Like you've got sort of like the construct of like a strong female character, but she mustn't be too unlikable. Because like if because yeah, one thing that we were talking about in like that discussion was how all sort of like the characteristics that you would say make a female character unlikable are characteristics that make a male character like mysterious and brooding, and
Mm-hmm.
there's very much a double standard between sort of like the emotions that a man is allowed to express and what a woman is allowed to. And yeah, like you can see it in sort of like how readers sometimes will react to memoir, because often like female writing is just sort of like assumed to be sort of like emotional and like whiny, and there's a lot of like stereotypes out there that do shape readers' expectations. and it does sort of like interest me, because like I've wondered if you had the same memoir sort of released under like a female name and a male name, whether it would get different reactions due to like
Mhm.
bias of readers. So yeah, it's just such like a relevant thing to like be aware of. And yeah, I know when we were discussing topics for this video today, like you were quite keen to look at how we both write about things that like some creative writing instructors and critics would advise us not to write about.
Mhm.
um, but yeah, I find that really interesting because like at the same time, like in my experience, I found like creative writing instructors would say, write what you know, and like base it on sort of like things that you're almost an expert in. And yet there's still like some things that are sort of like shied away from, that like people seem worried about sort of like encouraging people to write. But yeah, what you were saying about whether it's like a male writer or a female writer, that adds a whole new like dimension onto it, because there are like these really like unconscious biases, sort of like shaping like what we're encouraged to write and what we're expected to write.
Yeah, I think I'm glad that now it sounds like people are memoir writers are experimenting more with different genres, and like you said, you're having interviews and putting research in. I think that kind of will deflect this whole confessional writing shroud that is, to me, has kind of fallen on memoir writing. I became a real advocate once I started. Well, in the first place, once I experienced this issue with my husband and I wrote my book, I had a difficult time writing fiction. I don't know if that happened to you too. Well, you said that, right? You know, you couldn't go back to the fiction that you were writing because of the memory problems.
Mm.
But for me, it was just like, I have to write and read stuff that really happened to people.
Yeah.
Not fiction just seemed kind of contrived for me. And it's changed that way, but I have changed my taste in fiction, for sure. It seemed kind of manipulative and you know, that kind of passed, but I developed a real interest in memoir, and I think that it's out there, even though you hear agents and publishers kind of uh, roll their eyes at, oh no, not another one of these kinds of memoirs. And I read an interview with an agent who had just basically categorized them. I said, okay, this happens, you know, this trauma happens, and then they do this, and then they recover, and you know, it's the same old thing over and over again. And I thought, oh, you know, that's really unfair. For one thing, there's something inherent, I think, in people in storytelling where people want, you know, like to read that. I mean, look at the formulaic romance genre, which I don't read, but I mean, I can certainly respect people who read that and like it. It's, you know, that people like that kind of, they are intrigued by that. They don't want to read about depressing things necessarily, but they do want to read about hopeful stories and true stories too, I think. And so I'm just encouraged. I think that there are so many avenues you can take to writing a memoir, and memoir has almost become too broad a term, I think, for this type of writing that we're doing, that we're trying to do.
Yeah, like yeah, because like you've got so many different things that a memoir can do. Um and yeah, it is a really broad category, because like you've got all the different topics that memoirs can cover, but then you've got all the different like narrative devices that can be used, different narrative styles. And yeah, like I have been reading a lot of memoir like recently, and like I really love medical memoir, like both like on mental illness and physical illness, and the ones that sort of like combine the two, like especially about like neuropsychiatric illnesses. And yeah, I'm just thinking about what you said, like that agent said about how it's like a similar structure. But then even if like these memoirs do have similar structures, each one is so different and individual, and it's just infused with like this personal experience. So yeah, I've never actually thought of them as like being really similar and being, oh, it's just another one, because they're so different. And I think one of the reasons that I'm really drawn to memoirs just because it's like it's another person sort of like laying out everything that's happened to them and being really honest about it and making discoveries about sort of the process. Because like I was reading a great memoir last year by Gianni Vanasco. It's a memoir about sexual assault, so it's not actually a medical memoir. But yeah, she gets really analytical about sort of discourse of power and how that is wrapped up in like language. And yeah, she has like this whole section within her memoir like examining that on like a scholarly level. And I just love that because like it really sort of opened my eyes up to how versatile the memoir genre can be. And yeah, like recently I've read other memoirs that are like part memoir, part personal growth, part self-help, where we've got like sections at the end of each chapter that sort of sets out these exercises that a reader can do in order to like to process their own trauma. And yeah, like I'm finding that memoirs becoming like more and more this interactive genre, like because you've got the ones that actually have these self-help sections in, but even ones that don't really make you think about how sort of like these things that the author is writing about could apply to your own life, especially if you're reading sort of like memoirs on topics that you have personal sort of like links to as well. Like I just find that really interesting. And yeah, before like this illness, I think I'd only read like one or two medical memoirs, just sort of like by coincidence really. And yeah, now it's just like I'm really drawn to it. And I'm probably reading about the same amount of like creative nonfiction as I am fiction, which yeah, like before this, that like never happened. I was like really drawn to fiction. But yeah, even like writing my fiction now, I have noticed my writing style has changed. I'm now drawn to much darker stories, but I'm also putting more of myself into my characters and they're becoming sort of like more representational of things I've experienced. So the latest manuscript I was working on is a thriller. I just sent it to my agent a couple of days ago, so I'm just like a bit relieved that I met that deadline. But yeah, my main character in that has the same type of brain information that I've got, and I found it really interesting because I was working on that fictional manuscript about brain information, although like it's not sort of like the driving force of the thriller, it's just sort of like there as well. And I was working on that at the same time as working on my memoir, which is obviously all about my own experiences. And I just found that being able to sort of like access the sort of like brain information from a different perspective and just sort of like using fiction to explore it further was so helpful for me on like a level where I could just think about it more like analytically, but also be more creative about my thinking around it. So yeah,
That's very exciting to hear you talk about the interplay between fiction and nonfiction. And yeah, you sound like very productive. I can't imagine working on two different projects at the same time. That's wonderful. And incorporating your medical condition with your main characters, there's a real thrust now, in terms of writing about disabilities. And I think that some writers are doing it as talking about contrivance, just to kind of throw it in there into the mix and to make it more, up to date. Like, okay, this sociological issue, autism is a big thing now. Okay, well, let's throw in this type of character. And or like in my husband's case, bipolar. Most of these people that are supposedly bipolar are just not anywhere really near what I experienced anyway, with my husband's condition. And but you've actually lived it, so that's you're creating a whole new in and of itself, or an interesting dynamic for sure.
Yeah, and yeah, I did find like writing the sort of like fictionalized version of like the brain information was a lot easier than writing it in my memoir. And I think it's because like the fiction provides me with distance. And again, like I usually write fiction for escapism, and although like it wasn't quite as much escapism as usual because I'm still writing about this very real condition for me, it did allow me that level of escapism like at the same time. And obviously the thriller, like the brain information isn't like what the plot centers around. So I kind of wanted to show like my main character can still be like this like strong, like amazing detective character who is investigating this mystery and disappearance, and she's still managing to do all that despite the brain information. So like that was really important to me to show that like it's not just her brain information, because one of the things that I've encountered during my sort of like recovery stages is that some people now think that that is kind of like my only defining characteristic.
Yeah, exactly.
Like long-term sort of like chronic illness from it. So I just really wanted to show that like in this character that the brain information is there and it does affect every part of her life, but she's still so much more than the brain information. So yeah, that was one of my sort of like driving forces for including a main character with this condition, as well as raising more awareness for it and having like accurate representation of like disability and neuropsychiatric disorders in fiction.
Yeah. Well, did you do any reading before of other books that were similar, or not similar, but where the character displayed or the plot displayed the characteristics that you described, or did you just kind of come up with this on your own, this whole concept?
Well, I've been sort of like reading a lot of Own Voices, YA fiction, where particularly with like marginalized groups, I've been sort of like focusing on disability and chronic illness. So I've read a lot of books with characters and like main characters with these like illnesses and stuff. So I've sort of like used that in a way to guide me in like how those authors did it. But then at the same time, I have like veered away from sort of like the structures that I was seeing, because obviously like every sort of experience of illness is very different, even if it's the same illness. So I felt like I put a lot of myself into it as well. But yeah, I couldn't actually find any fiction like accounts of a neuropsychiatric illness or brain information causing psychiatric symptoms, because I found that there was either like it was divided between sort of like physical chronic illness or mental illness, and I couldn't find anywhere there was the overlap. And I found that really interesting for a number of reasons, really. Like, firstly, because there's not that much known about sort of how physical conditions can cause psychiatric conditions with like the workings of the brain. And also that means that like readers probably won't have come across it before, because like before I got this illness, I had no idea that these things existed. And I kind of do like one or the other. Whereas now I'm sort of like learning how like the brain and body is very much like linked together, and taking sort of a more holistic approach to it all. And yeah, writing sort of like this character is very much based on like the things that I've experienced. It was really therapeutic for me, and I was just really motivated to do it, like on a personal level, as well as writing sort of like my next manuscript, so to speak. Yeah, so yeah, do you have any advice for sort of like aspiring writers who want to write about like these heavy things that like typically they might be discouraged from writing about, like by certain people?
Well, I think that as a writer coming into it depends on how isolated you are. I think writers can be very isolated, and some encouragement needs to be there, or you need to have. If you don't have a mentor, I didn't have a mentor. A lot of people don't. They just, it's just a lot of hard work. And if you come across lists and you read other people have written something like yours, they use as a model. That kind of gets you going in the right direction. And in my case, there were so many people, that I encouraged, that I saw even in my MFA program, very well-known memoirists were, state emphatically, you just kind of you don't go into the heavy stuff, you don't engage at that level. And I think that it's discouraging to stop anyone or to writing what they feel, to getting down on the page, because maybe something that you get down right away isn't art, it isn't something that's going to churn up in your book, but it's still really important to get those feelings down in some kind of a format. And it isn't necessarily a turnoff to people, I don't think. I think melodrama is perhaps, something to steer clear of. Getting your feelings down is in a story format is excellent. And I think you interviewed Sue Williams Silverman a while ago, who is one of the great memoirists of our day, I think. And she's one of the things about her is that she's very encouraging for authors to tell their story their way. I mean, this is yours. And if it isn't necessarily accepted by publishers or some other designated, judge of literature at that time, who knows, at some point it could be held up as an example. And you have to use the tools that you have to write your story. And so that would be my suggestion. I think when I was a high school teacher, an English teacher, some of the best writing I could get out of my students, a lot of them were averse to writing. And they just said, no, they froze. I could get them to write things down. And to me, it was very interesting. Mm-hmm. This was just like, a lot of it, I said, I didn't worry about punctuation, grammar, whatever. I just got it down. And to me, a lot of just ordinary stories without necessarily being embellished as what someone would consider high literature are the most interesting to me. And maybe this comes from the fact that I was at one point really interested in documentaries. I'm not sure, but I think that there's so much going on. There's so many people who have interesting things to say that I hate. It just bothers me when someone says, "Oh no, you can't write about that. That's, you've got to." It's too melodramatic or over the top, because it can always be refined and good editor in a workshop situation. If you listen to what people tell you, maybe you can tweak it here and there, but don't listen to yourself first.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And also, if someone's telling you that what you're writing is like melodramatic, that's kind of like subjective in itself, because that's just like their opinion. So I don't think that you should sort of like base what you write on whether someone gives you permission to write it, because like writing, especially memoir, is just such a personal thing. And I find that, well, definitely with Captive, when I was writing those poems, I was writing it purely for myself. It was just like this safe space that I had just to sort of like untangle everything that I was feeling and try and process it and understand it more. So I think if like you're thinking about sort of like writing something very personal, but that touches on things that you're a bit worried that others might tell you not to write, maybe you just think about like why exactly you're writing it, and sort of like think whether you're just writing it for yourself, like as therapy and to help you like on a personal level, or whether you're writing it more with the intention of showing it to others. Because I do find that does sort of like change how I'm sort of like thinking about a project, because like with my poetry, like because I just wrote it at a time when like I was using it purely for myself just to like understand everything. I didn't sort of like feel all this pressure on me to sort of like make it comply with like others' expectations. But with my like narrative memoir, I'm writing that very much with the view straight away that this will be a book that will be published, hopefully, to raise awareness. So yeah, like I have found that is sort of like, I don't know, it's shaping the way I'm writing a bit more than with the poetry. So I felt like a lot freer in writing the poetry because of that. But yeah, a lot of it is the fear that is sort of like trying to hold me back with this sort of like narrative memoir, because I'm worrying more about what readers will think, what others will think, who like, especially people who know me if they then read this book. And yeah, I think fear is like this really powerful thing when you're writing a memoir. But yeah, like I'm just trying to like set my fear aside at the moment. But yeah, when I was talking to Sue Williams-Silverman, she was like very much saying like, don't set it aside completely. Use your fear in your writing and just like be really honest. So yeah, I think that's just really important.
Yeah, I think we should be encouraging people to write more anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
It's a way of discovering yourself,
Yeah.
and it may not all make it to publication, to commercial publication, or some whatever publication.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in terms of writing for other people, I think most writers I've known write for publication. I mean, well, of course, you're writing for yourself, you're in your daily journals or you like your poetry, but, ultimately that's where we want to go.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that can still come through some kind of inner channeling, I think. It doesn't all have to be torn apart and evaluated and, on every line. It can come out in an artistic way and be modified. And the important thing is to get your story down, by whatever method you can.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, because like writing a story is just so helpful on so many levels. And like what you were saying earlier about how like empowering writing is as well, and like especially if we're writing about trauma, because it's us then claiming it as like this thing that happened to us, but then we're sort of like using it in a way to sort of like understand ourselves and sort of like empower ourselves from it. So
Yeah, I know they're using it more um, in a lot of different cases, like for military personnel, members have come back and experiencing PTSD. They've started workshops, and some very good writing has come out of that, and definitely very raw writing, and it's been praised by the press. So there's all different levels of incidents and people's history that they can come down and be interesting for the public. That people I think, are wanting to devour that kind of writing these days.
yeah, exactly, because it gives like a really accurate insight into sort of like other people's lives that we wouldn't be able to access otherwise. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. And like even if like you're reading something and you have no personal experience to the situation or the trauma that the author is writing about, there will still be like little things in it that you can relate to that are sort of like universal human experiences as well. So yeah, I think that's just like why memoir itself is like such a meaningful genre, because it teaches you a lot about different things, but it's also just sort of like very open and honest about everything as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've really got it there. It's transportive for the reader, and also for the writer in a way.
Yeah.
And because it's real, it's in most cases, it makes it more significant. And being able to use fictional tools and whatever tools you can to create something is very exciting, something I'm looking forward to. I don't know at my age how much experimenting I can do. You know, I'm looking forward at least to reading more different kinds of memoir and kind of making some adjustments myself, experimenting myself in my own way.
Yeah. So yeah, we're coming up to the end of the time now. So should we just finish by telling viewers where they can find our books? So Jill.
Oh, sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, well, my book, again, one Pill Makes You Stronger, and I'm Jill Stegman. I'm sorry I didn't get my full name down there on the bottom. Stegman, or you can, it's available also from my website at jillstegman.com. And so you can go to either of those methods to finding my book.
Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah, don't worry about your name not being like your full name on the screen, because I'll make sure that it's in the title of the video. And then
Oh, okay, thank
in
you.
the description as well, we can I can put like the link to your website as well, and some links for where you can find your book as well.
Okay,
So,
excellent, thank you.
yeah, my book Captive, here it is. That is available sort of like all the usual online retailers and libraries as well. So yeah, thank you so much for joining me today, Jill. It's been a really great conversation, and like talking to other memoirists is something that I just love doing anyway, because it's always really sort of like valuable information that sort of I
Oh
get
yeah,
from conversation.
I loved it. You know, it helps provide a link to other people in the writing community, and I really appreciate it. This has been a really nice opportunity. Thank you so much, Madeline.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, it's just lovely talking to you.
Okay,
So
same here.
yeah.